Imagine the day beginning before the sun fully decides to appear, the air still cool, the sky still pale, and the world not loud yet, only the soft movement of water and reeds, because everything in this place learns to listen to the river first, to watch it, to respect it, to measure life by it, the slow wide flow of the Nile River carrying silt and stories, carrying yesterday's footprints away and bringing tomorrow's soil closer. And in this quiet half-light a village wakes, not with a bell, not with a clock, but with routine, with the same sequence repeated so often that it becomes the shape of comfort, the shape of survival, the shape of what normal means. You would see houses low and practical, made from mud brick, a material that looks humble but works perfectly in heat and dust, walls thick enough to keep the inside cooler, roofs flat, sometimes used like extra rooms, for drying food, for sleeping when nights turn warm, for watching the stars while the village settles, and inside these houses there is not much space to waste, not many objects that exist only for decoration, because most things must earn their place by being useful, by being carried, by being repaired, by surviving the year. In the corner you might find baskets, reed mats, a few clay jars, maybe a low stool, maybe a simple chest, and you might notice that the day does not start with dramatic speeches or heroic plans, it starts with small checks. Is the water jar filled? Is there grain left? Is there fuel for the fire? Is the baby asleep? Is the goat still tied? Is the bread dough ready? And these checks are not stressful in the way modern lists can feel. They are familiar, almost soothing, like touching the same stones in the same order on the same path, because repetition is a kind of safety. The first smell many people would know is the smell of bread beginning again, not fancy bread, not soft airy bread, but flat loaves, thick enough to be filling, made from emmer wheat or barley, ground on stone, the grinding itself a steady rhythm, back and forth, grain becoming flour with patience, and that patience is part of the morning, because some tasks cannot be rushed without ruining the result, and people in this world know exactly which tasks punish impatience. Breakfast is not a feast, it is a foundation, bread, maybe a bit of beer that is more like a nourishing liquid bread than what we imagine as beer now, sometimes onions, sometimes dates, sometimes a little fish if it was caught and dried, sometimes leftover stew if there was any, and for the better off there might be more variety, honey, fruit, perhaps some dairy, but even then the mood is not indulgent, it is practical, because the day is long and the body must be prepared. Outside, the village begins to move like a slow tide, children carry small tasks before bigger responsibilities find them, someone sweeps dust away from the doorway, someone checks a net, someone turns a jar to keep its contents safe, and far beyond the village, the fields wait, dark soil near the water, lighter sand farther away, and the question of the season is always present. Is it flood season? Is the water rising? Has it peaked? Is it falling? Is it time to sow, time to weed, time to harvest? Because time here is not a calendar page, time here is water level and wind and heat. When the flood has recently laid down its rich silt, the earth is generous, and this generosity is not taken for granted, it is managed, it is negotiated with canals and dikes and careful planning, a whole community thinking about where water should go, how long it should stay, how to keep it from turning into disaster, and you can feel that many lives are organized around these decisions. Decisions that are made not once but continually, because nature is steady until it isn't. A farmer walks out carrying tools that are simple but essential, maybe a wooden hoe, maybe a sickle later in the season, maybe a rope, and he does not walk alone, because farming is not a solo adventure, it is a network. Neighbors, relatives, children learning by watching, elders remembering older floods, and even when the work is individual, the survival is shared, because one bad year touches everyone, and one good year feeds everyone's confidence. But not everyone goes to the fields, and that is important, because daily life in this world is not one single lifestyle, it is layers, it is jobs, it is roles, it is who you are and what you have access to. In a big city like Memphis you would see administrators, craftsmen, dock workers, sellers, guards, boatmen, scribes, and the whole machinery of a state that collects grain, moves goods, organizes labor, and tells itself a story about order, about balance, about keeping the world from falling into chaos. The scribe is one of the quiet engines of this system, not loud, not muscular, but powerful, because writing is control, writing is memory that doesn't forget, writing is a promise that can be checked later, and you can imagine a scribe sitting with a palette, mixing ink, measuring, recording, listing, not because lists are beautiful, but because lists make the kingdom function. How much grain came in? Who owes labor? What was delivered? What was distributed? What the temple stores contain, and the scribe's day begins with precision, with careful attention, because mistakes are not romantic here, mistakes are trouble. Meanwhile, craftsmen in workshops begin their steady work, shaping wood, carving stone, firing pottery, weaving linen, pounding metal, and even the soundscape has a certain calm, repeated taps, scraping, the hiss of a kiln, the rub of fibers pulled into thread. It is not chaos, it is industry without frenzy, because everything is done by hand and the speed is human speed. And then there is the river again, always the river, boats moving like slow insects across the surface, carrying people, carrying reed bundles, carrying jars, carrying grain sacks, carrying stone blocks when necessary, and if you stand there long enough you realize the river is a road, it is a marketplace, it is a messenger, it is the easiest way to move anything heavy, and so daily life becomes a dance around loading and unloading, around timing, around currents, around knowing when it is safe to travel, when the wind is helpful, when to wait. In villages and towns, markets appear almost naturally wherever people gather, and the market is not a shining plaza of perfect order, it is a busy, dusty, living thing, sellers calling out, buyers testing fruit, smelling fish, squeezing bread, bargaining without anger, bargaining as a normal social ritual, because the price is not just a number, the price is a conversation, it is a relationship. It is a way to show you are not naive, that you understand value, and in this world value is often measured in grain, in labor, in goods exchanged, more than in coins. You might see a woman carrying a basket on her head with a posture that looks effortless because she has practiced it since childhood. You might see a child sent to trade a small measure of grain for onions. You might see bundles of flax, jars of oil, dried dates, maybe a little meat for those who can afford it, and around all of this the ordinary social life continues, gossip, news, small complaints, small jokes. The kind of talk that doesn't need to be recorded, because it is meant to fade. Like footprints in sand. And then, rising above this ordinary life, there are the temples, not just as religious places, but as economic centers, as employers, as storehouses, as landowners, as institutions that keep calendars, distribute rations, commission work, and hold festivals that break the routine in a controlled way, and in a grand city like Thebes the presence of temple life is especially strong, because the great complexes are not hidden away, they are part of the city's identity, stone and columns and courtyards shaping how people imagine power. If you approach a major complex like Karnak Temple, you feel a shift, the scale changes, the everyday becomes small, the walls rise, the gateways tower, the carvings and statues suggest that the world is watched, measured, blessed, judged, and even if you are not a priest, even if you are not allowed into every sacred space, the temple still affects you, because it owns fields that feed workers, it organizes festivals that fill streets, it stores grain that can save people during shortages, and it offers a kind of cosmic explanation for why life is arranged the way it is. Priests live a different rhythm than farmers, a rhythm of cleanliness and ritual, of washing, of changing clothes, of preparing offerings, of maintaining order in small repeated actions, and these actions are not random, they are believed to keep the universe stable, to keep the sun rising, to keep the river returning, and whether every person believes that deeply or not, many people treat the rituals with seriousness, because the rituals are tied to community identity, tied to food distribution, tied to authority, tied to the feeling that someone is paying attention to the invisible forces. And yet, for most people, daily life is not spent in the shadow of giant columns, it is spent in the middle distance between needs and hopes, between work and rest, and one of the most human parts of this world is how people find normal pleasures inside hard routines, a cool breeze near water, a good loaf, a successful bargain, a child laughing, a song hummed while grinding grain, a moment on a roof at night when the heat fades and the stars appear in heavy silence. As the morning becomes midday, the sun strengthens, shadows shrink, and the pace changes not because anyone is lazy, but because the body has limits, and people who work outdoors learn to respect the heat, to seek shade, to drink, to pause at the right time so they can continue later, and so you can imagine a small rest, maybe under an awning, maybe near a wall, maybe by a canal where insects hover. And during this pause people eat again, drink again, and the talk becomes slower. Somewhere in the background, the state exists like a distant weight, taxes and grain, labor obligations, officials traveling, messages delivered, and this can feel heavy, but it can also feel normal, because it is the air people breathe, the assumption that order comes from above, that the king's role is to maintain balance, and that balance is not an abstract concept, it is food arriving when promised, water arriving when expected, disputes settled before they turn into feuds. And disputes do happen, of course, because people are people, boundaries between fields, accusations of theft, arguments about deliveries, small injustices, and when those disputes rise, they move toward local authorities, toward scribes, toward elders, toward whatever structure exists to keep conflict from breaking the fragile harmony of shared survival. So part 1 ends in the middle of the day, with the sense that ordinary here is not empty, it is full of systems and small actions, full of water management and food preparation and trade and record keeping, full of temple influence that reaches into the marketplace, full of a quiet confidence that tomorrow will resemble today if the river behaves and if the community holds together. And as the sun leans toward afternoon, you can feel the next half of the day waiting, more work, more movement, more small decisions, and later, evening meals, rooftop air, stories, and sleep that comes not as an escape but as a reset, ready to begin again with the river. Midday is not a dramatic moment, it is simply the sun reaching the center of its authority, pressing down on roofs, on shoulders, on the backs of animals, on the surface of the water until even the river seems to shine with heat, and the village learns to adjust without complaining too loudly, because the sun is not an enemy that can be argued with, it is a fact, a force. And daily life here includes the quiet skill of surviving heat with dignity. You might notice how shade becomes valuable currency, a wall shadow that is only a hand's width wide is still used, a tree is a gathering point even if it is not large, an awning made from woven reeds creates a small miracle of cool air, and people time their efforts carefully, doing heavy tasks early, saving the finer tasks for later, and if someone is moving slowly it is not laziness, it is experience. It is knowing that exhaustion can steal the whole day if you spend yourself at the wrong hour. In the fields, this is the time of maintenance, of checking canals, of moving water with small adjustments, clearing blockages, strengthening edges, and if it is a season of growth then you would see hands moving through green, pulling weeds, thinning plants, making sure the young crops do not waste their strength competing with useless growth, because food begins as attention, food begins as time invested where it matters. If it is closer to harvest season, then the afternoon can be filled with cutting and bundling, the sickle flashing briefly, the stalks falling in rough lines, and there is a kind of calm teamwork to it, people spaced along the field, each person repeating the same motion, each person building a small pile that becomes a bigger pile, and the sound is not loud, it is the soft scrape of cut stalks, the occasional cough, the occasional short call to coordinate, and the constant rustle of plants moving against one another. And then, not far away, you might see animals doing their own share of the work, donkeys carrying loads, oxen pulling plows when the soil is ready, goats kept close, watched carefully, because animals are wealth that can walk away if you are careless, and in a world where most people do not have extra resources lying around, losing an animal is not just annoying, it is a serious injury to a household's future. Back in the village, the afternoon is where the home becomes a workshop again, because domestic life is not free time, it is another form of labor, often invisible when people tell history as if only kings and battles matter, but here it is everything, the constant turning of raw materials into something usable, grain into bread, flax into thread, thread into cloth, clay into pots, and the home is the factory of survival. If you enter a typical house, you see how the interior is arranged around heat, around storage, around small spaces, a hearth for cooking, jars for water and grain, baskets hung to keep insects away, and the floor might be packed earth, cool underfoot, and there might be a small area for sleeping, mats rolled up, linens folded, because space must transform throughout the day, the sleeping area becomes a living area. The living area becomes a workspace, and this flexibility is normal. Women often manage an enormous portion of this system, and that management is not a polite detail, it is a foundation, because food does not cook itself, cloth does not appear from nothing, children do not automatically survive, and so the daily rhythm includes grinding grain again, baking again, fetching water again, cleaning again, repairing again, always again, and you can imagine the strong muscles and forearms, the practiced movements, the efficiency that comes from doing something 1,000 times and still doing it with care. Water is always a central concern, because water is heavy, water is life, and even if the Nile River is nearby, carrying it still takes time and strength, and you can see people walking with jars, balancing them, moving in lines along paths worn smooth by generations, and this movement is so common that it becomes part of the landscape, like birds flying, like reeds bending. It is simply what happens. Children live inside this rhythm too, and childhood is not a separate protected world, it is mixed into the adult world, because children are needed and also because children learn by copying, and you might see them helping with simple tasks, chasing away birds from fields, carrying small bundles, watching younger siblings, and in between those duties they still find moments to play, throwing stones, racing, laughing, imitating adults. And the laughter is important, because it reminds you that even in a world of hard routines, people are still people. Not every child becomes a farmer or a laborer, and this is where the quiet ladder of society appears, because if a child is born into a household connected to administration or temple work, there is a chance of education, of learning to read and write, of entering the path of the scribe, and that path is like stepping onto a different road entirely, a road where your hands may not blister in the sun, but your mind must remain sharp, your memory strong, your focus unbroken, because writing is a craft as demanding as any other, just in a different way. A student scribe practices signs, repeats them, copies them, learns not only the shapes but the discipline behind them, learns how to sit still, how to observe, how to record without adding personal feelings, and the reward is security, the possibility of stable rations, of social respect, of being closer to power, and you can imagine a parent hoping for this path, not because they want to insult farmers, but because they know how fragile a farming life can be when the flood fails. In towns, the afternoon market continues but changes mood, because the heat thins the crowd, people come in shorter bursts, buying quickly, seeking shade, and sellers adjust too, keeping goods covered, keeping water nearby, and you might smell fish drying, smell onions, smell sweat, smell dust, and all of it blends into a scent that is not disgusting, just real. A living place where bodies work and food is handled and the air is full of sun. Trade is not only local, and this becomes visible in small details, a piece of stone not found nearby, a type of wood that must have traveled, a pigment that came from farther away, and you remember that the kingdom is connected by the river and by desert routes, and those routes bring more than goods, they bring stories, rumors, news about officials, news about temple festivals, news about labor projects. And these small pieces of information spread like wind-blown seeds. And then there are the larger projects that pull people out of their normal household rhythm for a time, state labor, building, quarrying, transporting stone, repairing temples, digging canals, and for a household this can be both burden and opportunity. Burden because a worker is away, opportunity because rations might be provided, because connection to a project can bring status. And you can imagine a man leaving the village for a season, joining a crew, sleeping with other workers, eating from shared supplies, living in a more communal and controlled environment than home. In those work crews, the day is structured by supervisors, by goals, by the need to move heavy materials safely, and even then the mood is not always brutal in the way people imagine, it is often steady, organized, with pride, with jokes among workers, with complaints that sound like complaints anywhere, and the sense that the work is part of a larger story, part of maintaining the great monuments and the divine order. And whether that story feels inspiring or simply unavoidable depends on the person and the moment. Temples are deeply tied to this labor world, because they are not only spiritual centers, They are logistical centers, they own land, they store grain, they commission repairs, they feed priests and workers, and they stage festivals that can transform the whole city for a few days. And if you have ever seen how a modern city changes during a major holiday, you can imagine something similar, but with drums and incense and chanting. With processions that move slowly through streets, with people crowding to see sacred images pass, and for many, this is one of the rare moments when daily routine is interrupted by something larger and more theatrical. The festival is not purely entertainment, it is also politics, it is also economy, because more visitors means more trade, more offerings means more temple resources, more visible power means more social agreement that the existing order is real and strong, and when people participate, they are not just watching, they are reaffirming, even if they do it with a tired face and dusty feet. Even if they are thinking more about dinner than theology. In the late afternoon, the heat begins to loosen its grip, shadows grow longer again, and the village breathes differently. People return to heavier tasks if they paused earlier. Someone goes to check traps, someone tends to animals, someone repairs a cracked jar with clever binding, someone patches a roof, because maintenance is endless and small neglect becomes big trouble, and this is also the time when social life becomes easier, because it is simply more comfortable to stand outside and talk when the sun is not punishing you. You might see neighbors sharing news, arranging small exchanges, planning for a wedding, discussing a dispute, remembering someone who died, because death is present here too, not in a dramatic horror way, but as a normal part of life, and the way people respond is often through ritual and community, through burial practices, through offerings, through remembering names, because being remembered matters. The idea that your existence leaves a trace matters. And this leads naturally to the way religion is not separate from daily life. It is woven into it, small household shrines, simple prayers, amulets worn for protection, the belief that unseen forces can help or harm, the comfort of thinking that the world has structure even when life feels uncertain, and in the evening, when people wash dust from their skin, when they sit to eat, when they look at the sky turning gold then purple, they might speak to their gods in small private ways, not always in grand temple language, but in personal language, asking for health, asking for a good flood, asking for a child to survive fever, asking for peace in the household. Dinner is often simple, bread again, maybe vegetables, maybe fish, maybe a stew if there is enough, and families eat together when possible, sitting low, sharing, and after eating there is a softness to the air, a moment when work slows, when people can tell stories, when a musician might play a simple instrument, when someone hums, when children lean against a parent and drift toward sleep. And then the rooftops become important again, because the roof is the evening space, where breezes are easier to catch, where insects are fewer than near water, where the stars feel close, and you can imagine people lying on mats, talking quietly, looking upward, seeing the sky as a familiar ceiling, not as a romantic mystery but as part of the everyday, and in that moment the whole day feels like a loop that has been completed. Not exciting, not empty, just full of small actions that held life together. So part 2 ends with evening settling, with the sense of a whole society running on repetition, on careful timing, on shared labor, on the constant presence of water and temples and record keeping, and the quiet miracle that millions of ordinary days can add up to a civilization that lasts for centuries. And in the next part, we can move closer to the city streets and workshop interiors, into the world of craftsmen, scribes, and temple staff, and we can watch how daily life changes as social class and location change, while still always returning to the same basic needs: food, water, shade, order, and hope. As the next day's heat begins to build again, you can feel how ancient Egypt is not one single scene, not one single lifestyle, because the moment you move from a village path into a city street, daily life changes its texture, the sounds get denser, the smells stack on top of each other, the air carries more voices, more footsteps, more work happening at once, and yet the pace is still human. Still measured by bodies and sunlight and habit, not by machines, not by engines, not by anything that can truly hurry time. A city morning has a different kind of beginning, doors open earlier, people step out with purpose, and the street itself becomes a living corridor, packed earth underfoot, dust rising with each step, walls on either side sometimes blank, sometimes painted, sometimes broken by small doorways, and above, the bright sky is sliced into narrow shapes by architecture, so that even sunlight feels like it arrives in controlled pieces. You might pass a baker first, and the bread here is not just household bread, it is production bread, stacks of loaves, large ovens, heat rolling outward like a visible thing, and you can smell the grain and smoke together, and nearby someone else is brewing, because the everyday drink is not always water. Water can be risky when stored badly, and beer is nutrition and hydration combined, thick and cloudy, shared by workers, carried in jars, poured into cups that have been used so often the rim is worn smooth. Then you reach the zone where workshops live, the place where the city's steady heartbeat is loud enough to hear, tapping, scraping, sawing, polishing, and you realize that the objects in museums were not born inside glass cases, they were born inside spaces like this, with sweat and dust and patience, a carpenter shaping wood that had to travel from somewhere else, a potter turning clay into jars that will hold grain, oil, water, a weaver pulling thread through a loom until linen appears like a quiet miracle of order. And all of these people are not artists in the modern romantic sense, they are skilled workers, trained hands, minds filled with measurements and methods, because survival does not tolerate sloppy craft. The weaver's world is especially hypnotic when you watch it, thread stretched, tension balanced, the repetitive pull and pass, the cloth growing line by line, and linen is more than clothing. Linen is status, linen is cleanliness, linen is ritual, linen is what you wrap around the body when you want to feel proper, and what you offer to institutions that demand purity, and in a hot climate. Good linen is comfort that can change how a whole day feels. In another corner you might see stone work, chisels and pounding stones, and that work is not always monumental, not always for statues or temples, sometimes it is practical, grinding stones, bowls, tools, but even practical stone must be shaped, must be smoothed, and smoothing takes time, and time is the hidden ingredient in almost everything here. And then, in the middle of all this physical labor, you encounter a different kind of power, a room that is quieter, where hands move less but consequences move more, and inside sits the scribe, or the student scribe, or the clerk whose job is to keep the world from becoming forgetful, because a kingdom can survive hunger, it can survive heat, it can survive storms, but it cannot survive confusion forever. And writing is the weapon used against confusion. You can picture the student's day like a long, slow discipline, sitting on the floor or a low seat, practicing signs until the hand obeys the mind, copying lines until the eye learns what correctness looks like, and the lesson is not only how to make symbols, it is how to behave, how to be calm, how to pay attention, how to listen when an older man speaks, how to accept correction, because this is a career built on precision. And precision is also a kind of morality here, a sign that you are reliable, that you deserve trust, that you can hold other people's property in the form of numbers and lists. And the writing itself is not casual, it lives on materials that must be prepared, pens cut and shaped, ink made and managed, surfaces kept clean, and you might see a roll of papyrus being handled with care, because this is not cheap paper, it is a crafted surface, and a mistake is not only embarrassing, it wastes resources, it creates confusion that can ripple outward. And the scribe's world is full of quiet anxiety about doing things correctly the first time. If you follow the path of writing into the larger system, it leads you straight into institutions, especially the temples and state offices, where goods are counted, stored, moved, promised, delivered, and here daily life becomes strangely administrative, even when it is ancient, because people have always needed organization when many mouths must be fed and many hands must be coordinated. Imagine the temple kitchens and storehouses, not as tiny side rooms but as whole ecosystems, big jars lined in rows, grain measured and redistributed, oil carefully poured, offerings prepared, bread baked not only for families but for the rituals that must happen on schedule, and for the staff who live on rations, and in such places you can feel the scale of the institution. Because an ordinary household might store enough grain for weeks, but a major temple stores enough grain to shape the survival of a district. The kitchen is a practical sacred space, not sacred because it is quiet, but sacred because it feeds the relationship between humans and gods, and you can imagine the routine, washing, chopping, grinding, stirring, baking, the same motions as in any home but multiplied, repeated by many workers, supervised, recorded, and timed, because offerings cannot be sloppy, offerings must be reliable, and reliable offerings reassure everyone that the universe is still being handled properly. Step outside again and you feel the city's circulation, people moving between these centers, carrying baskets, jars, bundles of reeds, cloth, tools, and the street becomes a river of its own, a human river, flowing around corners, pooling near busy points, thinning in quiet alleys, and sometimes you catch the sound of a dispute, a buyer complaining, a seller insisting, a small crowd forming, then dissolving. Because conflict is part of daily life but so is resolution, and people learn how to argue without burning the whole day into ash. If you keep walking, the city eventually guides you back toward the actual river, because all roads here remember where the water is, and near the river the world changes again, it becomes more open, more windy, more busy with loading and unloading, because the water is the easiest road for heavy things, and so the shoreline is like a workplace and a marketplace combined. You might see boatmen waiting, not in a romantic pose, but in a practical patience, checking ropes, checking sails, checking the weight of cargo, and cargo here is not only luxury, it is daily necessity, grain sacks, jars of beer, bundles of flax, stone blocks if there is a project, timber if it has arrived from afar, and each item has a destination that exists on someone's list, in someone's record, tied to someone's obligations. The dock area has its own smell, wet wood, fish, mud, sweat, and you can hear the dull thud of a jar set down too hard, the sharper sound of a rope pulled tight, the short commands between workers as they coordinate without needing long speeches, because when you lift heavy things you communicate with the shortest words possible, and everyone's body learns the same language of effort. And in the middle of this, you sometimes notice officials, not always grand, but visible, someone with a staff, someone with a tag of authority, someone who can ask questions that must be answered, someone whose presence makes workers slightly straighter, slightly quieter, because power in daily life is often not a dramatic confrontation, it is just the constant awareness that someone is watching, that your work is connected to a larger order. Now, if you want to see daily life under the strongest microscope, you go to a place built around specialized labor, where the whole community exists because of a single massive purpose, and one of the most vivid examples is Deir el-Medina, a settlement of artisans and laborers tied to elite tomb projects, where you can almost feel the difference in the air, because these people live close to their work. They live inside schedules and ration systems, and their daily life is shaped by the need to carve, paint, build, and finish what must be finished before time runs out. In such a community, the day can be structured like a pattern, work days and rest days, crews and supervisors, assignments distributed, and even though the work is intense, the routine can also create stability. Rations arrive, records are kept, and the community becomes unusually literate compared to many villages, because writing is not only for high officials. Writing becomes useful for anyone who needs to document shortages, disputes, absences, deliveries, because when your life is tied to a big institution, documentation becomes a form of protection. You can imagine a worker coming home dusty, hands rough, shoulders aching, but still stopping to talk with neighbors, still sharing a complaint that is almost calm because complaining is also a tradition, the way people push back gently against the weight of authority, and you can imagine a spouse managing the household rhythm, food, water, children, repairs, social ties, because the household is still the core unit, even when the state tries to organize everything above it. And then, beyond the living world, there is the ever-present horizon of death, not as horror, but as planning, because many people, even ordinary people when they can, prepare for burial, save small goods, choose amulets, arrange what will be needed, and you can feel how life and death are not separate categories here, they are neighbors, because the landscape itself holds both. The villages by the river and the necropolises in the dry land nearby. A place like Saqqara shows you that death is organized too, tombs, chapels, offerings, and the living interact with these spaces through visits, through rituals, through memory, because being remembered is a kind of continuation, and the daily life of a family includes not only feeding the living but honoring the dead when possible, because the dead are still part of the social network, still part of identity, still part of the household story. But daily life is not only duty, it contains small brightness too, and you find that brightness in moments that are almost boring in the best way, a successful repair, a quiet evening meal, a neighbor lending a tool, a child finally falling asleep, a breeze moving through a doorway, a song repeated while someone works, and these small moments are what make the big structures bearable, because people do not live inside monuments. They live inside repeated ordinary hours. Late afternoon becomes the city's softer time again, as the heat loosens, the streets fill a bit more, and you might see people returning from work, stopping at a vendor for something small, exchanging news, hearing a rumor about a coming festival, or a new official, or a shipment arriving, and everyone collects these fragments because information is a kind of resource too. It helps you prepare, it helps you avoid trouble, it helps you feel connected to the larger world. If you keep walking as evening approaches, you see how the city cools slowly, how shadows stretch, how the smell of cooking grows stronger, how rooftops become occupied again, and how the sound changes, fewer work noises, more domestic noises, pots clinking, voices inside courtyards, and in that gradual shift you understand something simple, that the greatness of this civilization is not only in stone, it is in routine, it is in human endurance and organization, it is in the way millions of ordinary days can be stacked on top of each other until they become history. Part 3 ends with the city settling into night, workshops quieting, docks slowing, writing put away, bread eaten, jars sealed, and the sense that tomorrow will begin again with the same needs and the same careful patterns, and in Part 4 we can go deeper into the sacred side of the everyday, not the grand theology, but the practical religion, household rituals, festivals, cleanliness, offerings, and the way temples act like the heart of a city, pumping food and labor and meaning through everything around them. In the city, once you begin to notice it, religion is not something that happens only on special days, it is not a separate room you enter and then leave behind, it is more like a thin layer spread over everything, like dust in sunlight, like the smell of bread that follows you down a street, because the sacred here is not an abstract idea floating far above people, it is practical, it is scheduled, it is clean, it is fed, it is carried, it is counted, and in daily life that means you can't really draw a clean line and say, here is ordinary life, and here is religion, because the line keeps dissolving every time you try. Start inside an ordinary home, not the grand home of a high official, just a normal household with limited space and endless responsibilities, and you may find small signs that the unseen world is being kept close, not with dramatic ceremony, but with simple repetition, a small household shrine space, maybe a niche, maybe a corner where a few objects are placed, a small figure, a little bowl, a tiny lamp. Something kept clean even when the rest of the house is busy, because to keep a corner clean is to say, I still have control over something, I still have order, and order matters. There are also amulets, little protective shapes worn on the body, tied into clothing, hung near a child, carried like quiet insurance, and you don't have to imagine everyone as a philosopher about it. Many people treat protection the way people treat luck anywhere, with seriousness mixed with habit, because when life has so many risks you can't fully control, you build a net of small comforts. And a small comfort can feel like a big thing when a fever comes, when food runs low, when a dispute threatens to grow, when the flood behaves strangely. Cleaning becomes more than hygiene, it becomes a daily ritual of readiness, washing hands, washing the body, changing cloth when possible, keeping cooking areas and storage areas as orderly as circumstances allow, because cleanliness is tied to dignity, and dignity is tied to being able to function, and in a world where dust and heat are constant, staying clean is not vanity, it is effort, it is discipline. It is a way of saying you have not been swallowed by the environment. Now take that same logic and stretch it into temple life, where cleanliness becomes almost an occupation, because temple staff are not only praying, they are maintaining, and maintaining here means washing statues, changing linens, preparing incense, preparing food offerings, sweeping floors, repainting surfaces, repairing small damages before they become large ones, because the temple is supposed to be stable, it is supposed to look like it belongs to a permanent universe, even though everything physical is always trying to crumble. A priest's day can feel like a careful sequence of tasks rather than a burst of mystical emotion, and that is important, because people often imagine ancient religion as constant drama, but much of it is routine, purification, dressing, opening doors, presenting offerings, reciting the correct words, closing doors, recording what was used, and then doing it again. Because repetition is the engine that keeps the institution running, and the institution is not only spiritual, it is a workplace. And workplaces need schedules more than they need inspiration. And while the inner sacred spaces might be restricted, the temple's outer presence is impossible to ignore, especially during festival seasons, because festivals are the moments when the sacred comes out into the street, and the street becomes a kind of moving theater, not theater in a casual sense, but theater that reaffirms the whole structure of society, like a giant public reminder that the world has a center, and that the center is powerful, and that life has a shape that everyone is expected to accept. Imagine the streets as they prepare for a procession day, people gathering early, vendors positioning themselves, children trying to climb to better viewing spots, dust already in the air because many feet are moving, and then the sound begins, drums, sistrums, chanting, the layered noise of excitement held in a controlled frame, because even celebration here has order, and in the middle of it you can feel anticipation. The moment when the sacred image or bark is carried, when people stretch their necks to see, when the crowd compresses and then loosens again like a breathing animal. In places tied strongly to temple culture, especially around Luxor Temple, these festival movements can change the entire mood of daily life for days at a time, because they pull people out of their normal schedules and give them a story that feels bigger than bread and water, and yet the funny thing is that bread and water still remain at the center, because festivals demand food, they demand supplies, they demand organization. They create a temporary economy of their own, more trade, more offerings, more work for craftspeople, more demand for transport, more need for security, and so, religion becomes a reason that ordinary labor increases. This is where you really begin to see the temple as an economic heart, because a temple is not just a building, it is land, it is storage, it is labor management, it is distribution, it is a place that can hire, feed, punish, reward, and remember, and when you live near such an institution your daily life is shaped by it even if you never step into the deepest sanctuary, because the temple's needs create work, and its stores create stability, and its officials create rules, and rules are the invisible architecture people live inside. Think about grain again, always grain, because grain is food and tax and wage and insurance at the same time, and the temple as a major storehouse becomes a kind of public stomach, taking in offerings and taxes and rents, holding them, measuring them, sending them out as rations, paying workers with them, feeding staff with them, and this system can look almost modern in its logic. Except it is carried out with jars and baskets and scribal notes rather than machines and spreadsheets, and the human element is everywhere, the fatigue, the pride, the arguments, the small mistakes, the occasional corruption, the constant need to check and recheck because everything is tangible and heavy and vulnerable. Now shift your view to the ordinary person standing at the edge of temple power, because for them, the temple is both comfort and pressure, comfort because it can provide festivals and rations and protection and meaning, pressure because it can demand labor and offerings and obedience, and in daily life that means you may feel grateful and resentful at the same time, the way people often feel toward powerful institutions. Because the institution helps you survive but also claims a piece of your life as payment. There are also moments when people seek answers, not from a friend, not from a neighbor, but from the sacred system, through oracles and signs and ritual consultation, and again it can be very practical. Someone wants to know whether a dispute will resolve, whether a journey is safe, whether a decision will bring trouble, and the desire behind it is not exotic, it is the same desire humans always carry, to reduce uncertainty, to feel that the future has a pattern, and if the temple can provide a pattern, even a symbolic one, people will reach for it. Meanwhile, on the other side of the river and on the edge of the living world, the landscapes of burial sit in their dry silence, and these places are not only about death, they are also about work, because funerary culture employs craftsmen, painters, stone cutters, carriers, planners, and the living interact with these spaces as part of family responsibility, as part of memory management. And when you think of memory as management, it sounds cold, but it isn't, it simply shows that love and respect also become actions, scheduled and repeated. A place like Valley of the Kings is famous for its grand scale, but the daily life behind it is made of ordinary motions, men carrying tools, mixing pigments, scraping rock, checking measurements, eating simple meals, complaining about heat, laughing at small jokes, returning home tired, because even when the goal is immortal glory, the process is still human labor done one day at a time. And at home, again, the evening returns people to the small scale, the family scale, the scale where politics becomes a rumor and the temple becomes a distant silhouette, and what matters is dinner, sleep, children, repairs, tomorrow's work, and the household's little rituals continue, a small prayer, a protective charm checked, a lamp lit, because daily life here has a rhythm that swings like a pendulum between the huge and the intimate, between stone columns and clay jars, between official order and personal worry. Sometimes, late at night, when the air finally cools and conversation slows, someone tells a story, not necessarily a grand myth, sometimes just a remembered event, a funny market scene, a tense moment at work, a neighbor's odd behavior, and in these stories you can hear how religion and daily life blend again, because people interpret events through the idea that the world is watched, that balance matters, that actions echo. And even if they don't use formal theological words, they still live inside a universe where order is not only political, it is cosmic, and that belief shapes how they endure hardship without feeling completely abandoned. So part 4 ends with that layered feeling, that the sacred is not a separate mountain, it is a river that runs under the city's pavement, under the market noise, under the workshop tapping, under the household bread smell, and tomorrow, in part 5, we can zoom in on the most intimate daily life of all, family structures, marriage, children, health, small illnesses, remedies, leisure, music, games, and the quiet ways people comfort themselves when life is hard but still must be lived. If you step away from the big walls, the tall gateways, the storehouses with their rows of jars, and the sense that some invisible hand is always counting and organizing everything, you eventually end up where most people actually spend their emotional lives, inside the small space of home, the household as a tiny world, a place that never feels finished, never feels perfectly clean, never feels perfectly safe, but still feels like the center, because it is where food becomes meals, where tired bodies become rested bodies, where children become older, where arguments rise and fall, where repairs happen in the same corners again and again, and where people learn the daily art of continuing. A household here is not just a couple in a room, it is often a wider knot of relationships, parents and children, sometimes grandparents, sometimes siblings, sometimes an extra relative who needs help, sometimes an apprentice or servant depending on status, and even when the house is physically small, the social world inside it is complex, because people's roles overlap. Someone can be a worker in the morning and a caretaker at noon and a storyteller at night, and you start to see that daily. Life is mostly the problem of switching roles smoothly without breaking, without letting the day fall apart. Marriage exists as part of this household structure, sometimes with affection, sometimes with practicality, often with both mixed together, because a household is not only about feelings, it is also about survival, and in a place where work is constant and risk is real, partnership is a tool as much as it is a relationship, two sets of hands, two sets of responsibilities, shared resources, shared protection, and you can imagine how the community watches these bonds carefully, because a household that fails can become a burden on neighbors, and a household that thrives becomes a small pillar supporting the whole village or street. You can picture the invisible work behind a stable household, storing grain so it stays dry, guarding food from pests, keeping water containers clean enough, keeping the hearth functional, patching cloth before it tears completely, teaching children what not to touch, what not to waste, how to speak to elders, how to carry a jar without dropping it, how to move in a crowded street without starting trouble. Because daily life here is full of little rules that are never written down but are enforced by experience and embarrassment and gentle scolding. Children are everywhere in this world, not in a sentimental, childhood is magical way, but in the realistic way that children bring noise and movement and mess and sudden laughter and sudden crying, and the household must wrap itself around them, because children are both joy and responsibility here is not an abstract idea, it is food, it is safety, it is preventing accidents. It is trying to keep sickness from turning serious, it is keeping a child warm enough at night and shaded enough at noon, and you can imagine how many small decisions a day contains when you are always thinking, is the child eating, is the child drinking, is the child too hot, is the child too quiet, is the child wandering toward danger. Learning happens mostly through watching and copying, not through formal lessons for most people, and a child's education begins with the body, how to move, how to carry, how to balance, how to kneel near the hearth without getting burned, how to fetch water without spilling too much, how to walk with a basket like it is part of you, and only later does education become more specialized, a boy or girl learning a craft, learning a trade, learning farming rhythms, or, in rarer cases tied to wealth and connections, learning writing, and you can imagine the household pride if a child is chosen for that path, because it means the child might escape the harshest forms of labor, might join the world where ink, not muscle, becomes the main tool. But even without writing, people are not unthinking, they memorize a huge amount, seasons, debts, favors, family ties, local history, who can be trusted, who argues too easily, who is generous, who is dangerous, and this memory is a kind of community archive carried in heads instead of in scrolls, and it shapes daily behavior, because reputation here is not a social media score, it is survival. It determines whether someone lends you a tool, whether a neighbor helps when you are sick, whether people show up when you need hands for harvest or repairs. Now, daily life also contains something that never becomes normal, no matter how common it is, the presence of illness, not dramatic and not described in a gruesome way, just the quiet reality that bodies can fail, that food can upset the stomach, that water can carry problems, that heat can weaken a person, that small cuts can become trouble, that a cough can linger, that a child can develop a fever, and because of that, households develop habits, both practical and symbolic, to reduce risk and to feel less helpless. You can imagine a typical day including simple preventive actions, washing when possible, keeping cooking tools clean enough, storing food carefully, drying fish properly, keeping grain sealed, and still, sometimes, sickness appears, and when it does, people turn to whatever knowledge exists around them, household remedies passed down, advice from older relatives, help from specialists when available, and also prayers, protective objects, small rituals, because when you don't control the situation fully you use every tool you have, including belief. There are healers and medical practitioners in the broader world, and there are written traditions of medical knowledge too, but for ordinary households, the first response is often local and practical: rest, warmth, water or beer in small amounts, food adjusted to what the stomach can handle, simple treatments applied with care, and it is less about curing in one sudden moment and more about managing, supporting, watching, hoping, and this watching becomes part of daily rhythm, someone checking on the sick person while still trying to keep the household running, because life does not pause just because one person is unwell. And while sickness is one side of the body's reality, the other side is work and fatigue, the constant tiredness that comes from manual labor and heat and repetition, and the household has to manage that too, because a person who collapses from exhaustion is a person who can't contribute tomorrow, so there is an unspoken intelligence in how people pace themselves, when they push hard, when they slow down, when they rest in shade, when they switch tasks, because endurance is a skill, and a lot of daily life is essentially endurance practice disguised as routine. Food is the main fuel for this endurance, and the food world is broader than bread and beer, even if those are the base, because daily meals change depending on season, location, status, and luck. Vegetables like onions and leeks, legumes when available, fish in many forms, sometimes meat on special days or when a household has access, fruits like dates and figs, oils and fats used carefully because they are valuable. And the act of cooking is not about novelty, it is about consistency, it is about making simple ingredients fill the stomach and keep a worker standing. The kitchen routine is also a social routine, because cooking often happens while conversation happens, while children hover, while someone repairs something, while someone grinds grain with a rhythm that becomes background music, and in that sense, daily life here has a lot of working together in the same space, not the modern separation where one person disappears into a private room. Because the household is small and the tasks are many, and it's easier when bodies share the same air. If you listen carefully, you can hear the household economy too, not only in money or grain amounts, but in negotiation. Who gets the larger piece of bread, who needs more because they did harder labor, who is pregnant and needs extra, who is a child and must be fed first, who is older and must be treated with respect, and these decisions are not always fair, not always peaceful, sometimes they create arguments. But the fact that they are constantly negotiated tells you that daily life is not automatic, it is managed. Even love is managed, because love without food is a fragile thing. Clothing is another quiet part of daily life that matters more than we think. Linen that must be washed, repaired, folded, and kept clean enough, sandals that break and must be fixed, simple jewelry and amulets that are worn not only for beauty but for identity and comfort, and the act of putting on clothing in the morning is not just a fashion choice, it is a social signal. It tells the world who you are, what work you do, what status you have, whether you belong to a temple environment with stricter expectations, whether you are a worker who needs practical simplicity. And then there is leisure, which exists even in hard lives, because humans always carve out small pleasures, not as luxury but as survival for the mind, and leisure here is often light and communal, a short visit with neighbors, sharing a drink, listening to someone sing, watching children play a game with stones or sticks, telling stories that drift between humor and caution, and sometimes dancing during festivals. And you can imagine how these moments act like breathing spaces inside the long tunnel of repetitive work. Music is not always a professional performance, sometimes it is just a rhythm tapped on a jar, a clapping pattern, a simple melody hummed while working, because rhythm helps work feel less endless, and when several people share a rhythm, they feel less alone, and that feeling matters, because loneliness in a hard life can be more dangerous than hunger. Loneliness makes people careless, makes people bitter, makes people stop trying. And daily life here rewards people who stay connected. Games appear in small ways too, not as huge entertainment industries, but as quick competitions, board games among those who can afford time and pieces, simple physical games among children, and these games teach skills indirectly: patience, strategy, fairness, endurance, and also they teach how to lose without breaking social ties. Because a community that can't handle small conflicts in play will struggle with bigger conflicts in real life. Now, zoom out slightly and you see how the household sits inside a neighborhood, and the neighborhood is its own organism, with shared wells or water points, shared paths, shared walls, shared gossip, shared risk, shared help, and this is where daily life becomes social management again, greeting the right people, showing respect, not insulting someone with careless words, knowing when to speak and when to stay quiet, knowing how to ask for help without appearing weak, and how to offer help without appearing arrogant, because status is fragile and pride can be as sharp as any tool. Sometimes, daily life includes small legal or administrative moments too, not always court drama, but practical paperwork and witness statements, a dispute about a boundary, an argument about a delivery, a complaint about missing rations, and in those moments you can feel the presence of the state and temple systems again, because the ordinary person doesn't live inside politics. But politics lives inside the ordinary person's life anyway, in what they owe, in what they are promised, in what they fear losing. And for women, daily life often includes another layer, managing not only food and cloth but also pregnancy, childbirth, and the health of infants, and this is part of why protective practices and rituals matter so much, because the future literally depends on fragile bodies surviving, and communities develop strong support networks around these events, older women helping younger women, neighbors assisting, households cooperating, because even if life is tough, people understand that a newborn is not just a private matter, it is the community's continuation. Even grief has a daily life shape, because death, when it happens, triggers duties, visits, mourning behaviors, arrangements, and then the household must return to routine again, not because people don't care, but because routine is how people endure pain without being destroyed by it. You cook because someone needs to eat, You fetch water because tomorrow still arrives. You speak the name of the lost person so memory doesn't vanish. And the act of remembering becomes part of the households. Daily rhythm, especially during certain times when offerings are made or visits happen, and in that way the living and the dead remain linked without constant dramatic sadness, just steady respect. So part 5 is really the most human part of this world, because it shows that the civilization is not only built on stone and records and temple walls, it is built on the endless small work of keeping a household alive, on the quiet negotiations over food and rest, on the ways people soothe fear with ritual and community, on the way children learn by copying and laughing, on the way illness is managed with patience, on the way leisure is carved out like a small candle flame protected from wind, and when night comes again and the roofs fill with bodies resting under stars, the day is not remembered as history, it is remembered as tiredness and bread and conversation and the feeling that, for now, things held together. In many places, people think of a year as a circle you can draw on paper, neat months, neat numbers, neat squares on a calendar, but here the year feels more like a living creature you can't fully control, and more like a river you can't convince to behave differently, because the true calendar is water, the true calendar is the rise and fall of the Nile River, and if you want to understand daily life deeply, you do not start with kings or temples, you start with the seasonal pulse that decides whether bread will be plenty or thin. The river is not simply there, it is always becoming, sometimes slow and stable, sometimes swelling, sometimes spilling, sometimes carrying more silt than usual, sometimes less, and the people who live close enough to depend on it develop a special kind of attention, an attention that looks like instinct from the outside but is actually trained observation, because they must notice changes early. They must sense whether a flood is promising or worrying, and you can picture someone standing near the bank in the early morning, quietly watching the waterline, reading the river the way another person might read a page. When the flood season approaches, the atmosphere in villages and towns shifts, not with panic, but with a quiet seriousness, because a good flood means a good future, and a poor flood means a hard year, and no amount of optimism can fill an empty jar, so people prepare, they repair dikes and canals, they check storage spaces, they strengthen the edges where water might cut too aggressively, and these preparations are not glamorous. They are muddy and repetitive, and yet they are some of the most important work a community can do. Think about canals, the hidden veins of the landscape, cut and maintained by many hands, guiding water into fields, holding it long enough for soil to drink, releasing it when the time is right, and every year these channels need attention, because water does not politely stay inside the lines humans draw, it tries to find its own path, and if you leave a canal unattended it silts up, it breaks, it turns from a tool into a problem. And so daily life includes canal work the way a body includes breathing, often unnoticed until it fails. There is also a social side to this, because water management is never purely technical, it is political at the village scale, who gets water first, who gets enough, who has the right to open or close a channel, whose field sits in a more favorable place, and when you live inside this system, you understand that fairness is not a philosophical debate, fairness is whether your children eat. Fairness is whether your labor produces something you can keep, and so communities develop rules, customs, and sometimes conflicts around water, and those conflicts must be handled carefully, because if neighbors become enemies the whole system collapses. As the flood arrives, you can imagine the landscape changing, the river widening, the edges blurring, low lands becoming shallow water, paths disappearing, and for a time, certain kinds of field labor pause, because the land is underwater. But work does not stop, it shifts, because this season has its own tasks. Fishing becomes more important for some, boat travel becomes more central, repairs and planning continue. And the household changes its daily rhythm, because movement across water is different than movement across dry ground. This is when the river becomes the most obvious road of all, boats moving constantly, not for romance but for logistics, carrying messages, carrying supplies, carrying people between places that are temporarily cut off by water, and you might see families adjusting, storing more food at home because travel is harder, doing more domestic crafts because outdoor labor is restricted. And in these adjustments you see the flexibility of daily life, the ability to change routines without losing stability, because stability here is not about doing the exact same thing every day, it is about meeting the same needs through whatever season makes possible. Meanwhile, in the larger system, flood season is not just an agricultural phenomenon, it is a moment of measurement, because institutions want to know how strong the flood is, and stronger institutions mean more measurement, and measurement means scribes, and scribes mean records, and records mean taxes, because once you can measure land and water and yield, you can also calculate what is owed. And in that calculation you can feel the ancient state breathing. The idea of tax here is not modern money taken from a paycheck, it is often grain, labor, goods, and it is deeply tied to survival and resentment at the same time, because taxation can fund projects, maintain canals, store grain for bad years, but it can also crush households when demands are too high, and daily life sits in the tension between these truths, grateful when the system works, angry when it doesn't, and always aware that obligation is not optional. So when the flood begins to retreat, when the waterline pulls back and leaves behind wet dark soil, you can almost feel the whole country inhale, because now the land is ready, now the time to sow arrives, and this is one of the most intense periods in daily life, because timing is everything, the soil is soft, the moisture is present, seeds must go in before the land dries too much, and so the fields fill with people moving in lines, spreading seed, sometimes using animals to help, pressing seed into earth, covering it, protecting it from birds, because birds notice opportunity as quickly as humans do. Sowing is not only work, it is hope made physical, because every handful of seed is a small gamble, you throw it into the earth and trust that it will become more than itself, and when you live year after year by that gamble, you develop a kind of faith that is not necessarily religious, but practical. You learn to act as if the future will arrive, because if you stop acting that way the future definitely won't arrive. The days during sowing season can be long, and not always in an exhausting frantic way, but in a steady push, sunrise to afternoon, bodies moving, hands repeating, and the household management becomes more complex, because someone must still cook, someone must still fetch water, children must still be watched, and so you see how labor is shared, older children take more responsibility, neighbors coordinate, and everyone understands that this is the time to work hard because later you will need the result. Then comes the season of growth, the quieter middle, when the fields are green and daily life is a pattern of maintenance, weeding, checking water, guarding against pests, and you can picture someone walking along the edge of a field in the morning, not doing big dramatic labor, just watching, noticing if water is flowing correctly, noticing if a section is too dry, noticing if animals have gotten in. Because agriculture is not only about big moments like sowing and harvest, it is also about the long quiet vigilance in between. During this growth season, other kinds of work gain more space: crafts, trading, repairs, temple duties, administrative tasks, because the fields are not demanding full mobilization every day, and so daily life can feel slightly more balanced, and this is often when people plan social events more easily: weddings, gatherings, larger repairs, because the household is not completely consumed by field urgency. But then, inevitably, harvest approaches, and the calm changes again, because harvest is the moment when the year's effort turns into visible survival, and this moment is both joyful and stressful, because if something goes wrong during harvest, if a storm hits, if a fire starts, if storage fails, you lose what you can't replace, so people become focused, careful, cooperative, and the fields fill with cutting, bundling, carrying, threshing, winnowing, and you can imagine the whole sensory world of harvest: dry stalks scratching skin, dust and chaff in the air, the sound of bundles hitting the ground, the steady rhythm of work, and the relief that grows each day as more grain is safely gathered. Threshing is a whole world of its own: grain separated from stalk reused as fuel or building material, nothing wasted if possible, because waste is a luxury, and you might see animals helping, or people using tools, and after threshing comes winnowing, tossing grain so wind can carry away lighter chaff, and the wind becomes a partner, and you watch people wait for the right breeze, because nature is still involved in every step. And then the most important part: storage, because harvest means nothing if you can't keep what you collected, and storage is not just stacking sacks, it is managing pests, moisture, theft, spoilage, and so households use jars, sealed containers, elevated storage, careful placement, and the knowledge of which corners of a house stay drier, which areas get too hot, and these details are part of the household's mental map, part of the quiet intelligence passed down through experience. At the same time, larger institutions are collecting their portion, and this collection is not a rumor, it is physical: officials arrive, measures are taken, scribes record, quantities are moved, and the household feels the weight of it, because you can see your grain leaving, you can see your labor transformed into something you must give away, and the emotions are complicated, because maybe you understand the necessity, maybe you resent the demand, maybe you fear that officials will take too much, maybe you worry that if you argue you will be punished, and this worry becomes part of daily life during tax season, a background tension that changes how people speak and behave. But the system also redistributes, not always fairly, not always kindly, but it does redistribute: rations paid to workers, grain stored for temples and projects, food provided to crews, and in that flow you see how the state and temple are like giant mouths and stomachs again, consuming and then feeding, and daily life for many people is tied directly to ration schedules: when bread is issued, when beer is distributed, when oil is provided, when cloth is delivered, and missing a ration can be a disaster, so people pay close attention to these schedules the way modern people pay attention to wages. This is one reason scribes matter so much, because a missing record can mean a missing meal, and so daily life in a ration-based world includes paperwork anxiety, the fear that your name is written wrong, that your delivery was not properly recorded, that a supervisor will claim you were absent, and in response people develop behaviors that protect them: witnesses, receipts, statements. And again you see how ancient life is not naive, It is bureaucratic in its own way, and bureaucracies always create their own daily rituals. Outside agriculture and administration, the year also contains cycles of festivals and religious observances tied to seasons, because when your whole life depends on natural cycles, you naturally attach meaning and celebration to those cycles, and you can imagine how a village feels after a successful harvest: more laughter, more generosity, more willingness to share a drink, because the immediate fear of hunger has loosened, and people can breathe, and in that breathing they create celebration, not purely for fun, but because celebration is a communal way to acknowledge survival. Even clothing rhythms can follow seasons: lighter linen during hotter months, more layers or thicker cloth at night during cooler times, and you can imagine how the body learns the year through sensation, how skin remembers the feel of flood humidity, how hands remember the scratch of harvest chaff, how eyes remember the glare of midsummer sun, and that memory is the real calendar, stronger than any written date, because it is stored in the nervous system. If you ask an ordinary farmer what month it is, the answer might not be a neat number, it might be a description: the water is rising, the water is falling, the fields are green, the harvest is near, because time here is named by what the land is doing, and that naming shapes daily life. It shapes what people expect of themselves, what they expect of neighbors, what they expect of institutions. And it shapes the emotional tone of each season, the cautious hope of sowing, the steady vigilance of growth, the anxious effort of harvest, the tense counting of taxation, the quieter domestic focus of flood season when outdoor work shifts. And in the background, always, there is planning, not abstract planning, but physical planning: how much grain to keep for food, how much to save as seed, how much to trade for oil or cloth, how much to set aside for offerings. And these calculations happen in households without formal mathematics, because you don't need formal mathematics to understand scarcity, you only need experience. And experience teaches people to think ahead, sometimes generously, sometimes fearfully, but always with the awareness that the year can turn against you. So part 6 ends with the sense that daily life is not only the day, it is the year, and the year is not only a circle, it is a pulse, and everyone's routines are synchronized to that pulse whether they want to be or not. And in part 7 we can follow that pulse into moments of crisis and resilience: what happens when the flood is weak, when food is short, how households adapt, how communities support or fail each other, how temples and officials respond, how markets change, how people stretch meals, how they change work patterns, how they hold on to dignity when the year becomes heavy. Some years feel like they were designed to be remembered, not because something heroic happened, not because a famous name carved a victory into stone, but because the ordinary routines start to creak, and when routines creak, everyone hears it, because daily life here is built like a carefully stacked wall of small habits, and one weak season can make the wall wobble, one uncertain flood can make the future feel thinner, not dramatic like a storm, but thin like a blanket that no longer covers your feet at night. The first sign is often not hunger, not yet, it is worry, and worry has its own daily schedule. You wake with it, you carry it to the water point, you carry it to the fields, you carry it into the market, and it changes the way people look at food, because when life is stable, a loaf is a loaf, but when life feels uncertain, a loaf becomes a measurement of time. How many days can this feed us? How long until the next delivery? How long until the next harvest? How much can we stretch? What can we trade? What can we save? In a household, shortages begin as quiet adjustments, not a sudden collapse, and those adjustments can look almost invisible to an outsider: a smaller portion, more water mixed into dough, a stew made thinner, more onions and less fish, a decision to eat the good food less often, a decision to save more grain as seed even when the stomach wants it now. And these decisions are painful because they require you to argue with your own body, and yet they are made anyway, because the mind knows that a hungry week now can prevent a starving month later. People also begin to count more carefully, and counting becomes its own kind of daily labor, not only scribes counting in official spaces, but families counting in their heads: how many jars are left, how full is the storage, how quickly are we burning fuel, can we afford to cook something that takes longer, should we switch to foods that require less fire, because fire is fuel and fuel is labor and labor is time. And time is always the thing you never truly have enough of. When the year feels uncertain, the market changes mood, you can almost hear it before you see it: voice is sharper, bargaining tighter, fewer casual purchases, more careful inspection, more suspicion about quality, because when you can't afford to waste anything, you also can't afford to trust too easily, and sellers notice this. Sellers respond to it. Some become kinder because they know their neighbors. Some become harder because they fear for themselves, and the same human differences you see anywhere appear here too: generosity and selfishness, cooperation and opportunism, sometimes mixed in the same person depending on the day. Prices don't need to be written on walls to be felt. A small change in what grain can buy ripples through the whole community, because grain is not only food, grain is exchange, grain is the bridge between your labor and someone else's labor, and when that bridge narrows, daily life becomes more tense, because every trade now matters more, every bargain becomes heavier, and people begin to postpone things they wanted: cloth that can wait, a tool repair that can be delayed, a small luxury that suddenly feels irresponsible, not because anyone gave a speech about responsibility, but because the body understands scarcity faster than the mind can explain it. In these times, households become more dependent on social networks, and this is where you see the true shape of community, because when the year is good, community looks like friendship and small favors. But when the year is bad, community becomes a safety net, or it becomes a web that tightens, and you can watch people test relationships without meaning to. A neighbor who lends grain now expects grain later. A family that helps now might ask for help during harvest, and none of this is evil. It is the logic of survival, but it can create quiet pressure, because being in debt is not only a financial state, it is a social state. It changes how you walk into a conversation, how you greet someone, how you ask for a favor without feeling small. And still, daily life must continue. Children still need water, elders still need food, work still has to happen, and this is the strange part of hardship: it does not pause the schedule, it just makes the schedule heavier. So you see people working while worried, cooking while worried, sleeping while worried, and sleep itself changes, because worry makes you wake up early, worry makes you dream in fragments, worry makes your mind rehearse worst outcomes the way a body rehearses emotion, and then morning comes and you do the same tasks again, because that is what survival is: repetition even when you don't feel like repeating. Sometimes, in harder years, people change what work they do. A farmer who normally focuses on fields might spend more time fishing or trapping if waters allow. A household might increase craft production to trade for food, weaving more, making more pottery, offering services, because when grain is tight, any skill that can become exchange becomes valuable, and you begin to see how flexible this society can be. How people are not locked into one identity, they are often many things at once when necessary, farmer and fisherman, weaver and seller, laborer and messenger, because the goal is not to be true to a career, the goal is to keep the household alive. Institutions matter more during these times too, and people talk about them more, because when life is stable, the big systems can fade into the background, but when life tightens, everyone notices where support might come from or where pressure might increase. If rations exist, they become crucial. If storehouses are open, it becomes a story repeated in streets. If officials demand the usual amounts even during a bad year, resentment grows quietly, because resentment is often quiet at first. A look, a pause, a sentence that ends early, a complaint shared only with trusted people, because open conflict is dangerous, but private anger can spread like smoke. You can imagine the tension around deliveries, around lists, around whether a worker is marked present, whether a household receives what it expects, whether a supervisor claims someone was absent, and in a world where documentation can decide meals, people become careful. They bring witnesses, they keep track, they remember who said what, because memory becomes armor when resources are thin. There is also the practical reality of migration, not always dramatic mass movement, but smaller shifts, a person leaving a village to look for work in a town, a household sending someone to join a crew where rations are more reliable, a young person seeking apprenticeship, because apprenticeship is not only a path to skill, it can also be a path to food security, and these movements change the emotional texture of daily life. Because separation is hard, and yet separation is sometimes chosen. Because staying together without enough food can be even harder. In the household, you see resilience expressed in small systems, not heroic speeches, small systems, like saving the best jar lids for the most important foods, like keeping seeds separated so they don't get eaten in desperation, like drying and storing anything that can be stored, like turning leftovers into something new so nothing is wasted, like using less fuel by cooking once and eating cold later, like sharing a roof space with neighbors during heat because it costs nothing and it keeps spirits up, and you realize that resilience is often just cleverness repeated, not once, but daily, until it becomes a habit. People also rely more strongly on ritual during uncertain times, not because ritual magically fills jars, but because ritual gives shape to fear, and fear without shape is worse, fear without shape is chaos, and daily life here is always trying to resist chaos, so you might see more small offerings, more protective actions, more attention to signs, more prayers spoken quietly while doing ordinary work. And even if you think of it as psychology rather than religion, the effect is similar. It helps the mind feel less alone inside uncertainty. At the same time, festivals can become more emotionally important, not less, because celebration is not only for good times, celebration can be a tool to keep a community from collapsing into despair, and so even in harder years, people still gather when they can, they still sing, still share what little they can, because a shared meal, even a small one, can feel like a powerful statement, a statement that says we are still here. We still recognize each other, we still belong to the same place. And belonging is a resource too, sometimes as important as grain. Children, of course, experience hardship differently, not always understanding the long-term reasons, feeling it as immediate changes, less food, more tension, adults more tired, adults less patient, and daily life becomes partly about protecting children from the full weight of fear, not always successfully, but you can imagine adults trying, distracting with small games, telling stories, keeping routine stable even if the portions shrink, because routine is one of the few forms of comfort that doesn't require extra resources. And when a year is difficult, small disputes can become sharper, because scarcity makes everything personal. A missing tool becomes a serious problem, a stolen loaf becomes a crisis, a broken jar becomes disaster, and so communities need conflict resolution more than ever. Elders, local officials, informal negotiations, sometimes harsh punishments. Because the community cannot afford endless feuds when survival requires cooperation, and in this you see the constant balancing act, keeping order without breaking people, enforcing rules without destroying relationships, and the balancing is never perfect, because humans are never perfect. There is also a deep irony in these difficult years, that they can reveal hidden strength, because when resources are abundant, skill can seem unnecessary, but when resources are tight, skill becomes visible. You notice who can stretch food, who can repair instead of replace, who can find alternative sources, who can keep morale up with humor, who can organize neighbors for a shared task, and these people become quietly respected, not as leaders with crowns, but as anchors, the ones who help daily life continue even when the year tries to stop it. And then, slowly, the year turns again, because nature does not care about your fear. The river continues its cycle, the fields still ask for seed, the sun still rises, and sometimes the next flood is better, sometimes the next harvest is kinder, and relief arrives gradually, not like a trumpet, but like a jar that becomes heavier again, like bread that becomes thicker again, like a market where people argue less sharply again, like laughter returning with less effort, and in that gradual relief you can feel how much tension people have been carrying without always speaking it. Even after a hard year ends, its memory stays inside habits. People remain cautious longer than necessary, saving more, storing more carefully, not trusting abundance too quickly, because once you have lived through scarcity, you learn that abundance is not permanent, and so daily life in the following years carries a slightly different shape, more attention, more reserve, more appreciation for small comforts. And that appreciation can make ordinary days feel richer, even when the food is still simple. So part 7 ends with that realistic, quiet truth, that ancient daily life is not only routine and work and ritual and markets, it is also the ability to absorb uncertainty without completely falling apart, to keep cooking even when worried, to keep sewing even when afraid, to keep bargaining even when tired, to keep laughing when you can, to keep rituals alive because they give fear a container, and to keep the community stitched together with favors and memory and shared effort, because the opposite of survival here is not only hunger, it is isolation, it is disorder, it is the feeling that you are alone against a world that is too big. When people imagine ancient societies, they often imagine a clean staircase, the king at the top, then priests, then scribes, then craftsmen, then farmers, and so on, like a diagram that makes everything feel simple. But daily life does not feel like a diagram when you are living it. It feels like walking through a town where you can sense invisible walls, not stone walls, not gates you can point at, but boundaries made of clothing, language, confidence, access, and the quiet fact that some people can say no and some people cannot. In the morning, those boundaries appear in the smallest details, in what kind of house you wake up in how much air and space surrounds your body when you stand up, in whether you step over a sleeping child on a mat or whether you step out into a larger room with furniture and storage and privacy. And it is strange how quickly the mind becomes used to whatever it is given, how a small house can still feel like home, how a large house can still feel like a cage, because comfort is never only about size, it is also about stability, about knowing whether tomorrow will match today. A modest house is built for survival first: thick mud brick walls, a roof that can double as living space, storage areas that must be protected from pests and moisture, and a layout that changes through the day, the sleeping space becoming the working space becoming the eating space, and you can feel how daily life in such a house is an endless choreography of moving objects, rolling mats, lifting jars, shifting baskets, because the house is like a single room that must become many rooms without ever growing larger. A wealthier house, by contrast, has a different kind of rhythm, not necessarily a happier rhythm, but a different one: more separation between tasks, more rooms, more specialized spaces, more privacy, and privacy changes how people behave, because privacy allows you to pause without being watched, to speak quietly, to rest without feeling guilty, and in a world of constant labor, the ability to rest without being judged is a form of power that is easy to underestimate. Even before you see a person's face, you can often guess their social position by clothing and cleanliness, not because everyone is trying to show off, but because daily circumstances create visible patterns: linen that is finer and lighter, a garment that fits better, a belt or jewelry that signals access, hair arranged with more time, skin less battered by sun, hands less cracked by grinding and hauling. And these things are not moral signs, they are environmental signs. They show what kind of work a body does and what kind of protection a person can afford. But class is not only visible, it is audible too, in how someone speaks to an official, in whether they use careful respectful phrasing or whether they speak more directly, in whether they know the right words for administration, for measurements, for obligations, in whether they can read a simple notice or must rely on someone else to interpret it, and this reliance is itself a daily experience. Because dependency is not only about food, it is also about information. There is a difference between waking up to the day and waking up to the system, and for many people, the system arrives early, in the form of duties that are not negotiable, labor obligations, expected deliveries, attendance for a crew, a supervisor's instructions, a list that decides what you will do today and how long you will do it, and when your day is shaped by a list someone else controls, your internal world changes. You become careful, you become alert to authority, you learn to manage your expression, because in a hierarchical society, the face is part of survival. For someone in administration, daily life can feel lighter in the muscles but heavier in the mind, because the work is not lifting and carrying, the work is remembering and recording, dealing with requests, with complaints, with shortages, with pressures from above, because authority does not remove stress, it often relocates it. It turns stress into responsibility, into fear of making the wrong decision, into fear of being blamed, and that fear shapes how an official behaves, sometimes making them rigid, sometimes making them cautious, sometimes making them cruel in small ways, not because they enjoy cruelty, but because they are trying to protect themselves. The difference between a laborer's day and an official's day is not only what happens, it is how time feels, because for the laborer the day is a long physical line, effort to effort to effort, with breaks measured by shade and thirst, while for the official the day can feel like a web, many small interactions, many decisions, many moments where you must appear competent, where you must speak in the right way. And both kinds of days can be exhausting, just in different languages of exhaustion. In the market, class is visible as behavior. A person with fewer resources bargains harder not because they love conflict but because small differences matter, because one extra handful of grain changes the week, while someone with more resources can bargain as a performance, a ritual, sometimes almost playful, because losing a little value does not threaten survival, and the market responds to these differences. Sellers know who can be pushed, who will walk away, who will come back, who has options, and you realize that even prices are shaped by social position. Even the act of buying onions carries the weight of hierarchy. Food is one of the clearest mirrors of class, not in the basic staples, because many people share bread and beer as foundations, but in variety, in frequency, in the ability to eat something not because you must but because you want. A richer household can add more sweetness, more fats, more meat on more occasions, more fruit not only when it is cheap, and this changes daily life subtly, because diet shapes mood, diet shapes energy, diet shapes health, and over years these differences become visible in bodies, in endurance, in the way a person ages. At a work site, class is visible in distance, not only physical distance but social distance, who stands close to decision-making and who stands close to the heavy material, who speaks and who listens, who can stop and who must continue, and you can feel how the smallest gestures reinforce hierarchy, a supervisor's glance, a worker's lowered eyes, a command given without explanation, a correction delivered publicly. And yet within this, you also find human cracks where hierarchy softens, a supervisor who shares water, a scribe who quietly helps a worker get their ration recorded correctly, a craftsman teaching a younger apprentice with kindness, because daily life is not a perfect machine, it is a living thing full of individual choices that sometimes resist the system in small gentle ways. Class also appears in mobility, who can travel freely and who must stay near their assigned labor, who can choose to move to a different neighborhood and who is rooted by debts and obligations, and mobility is not only travel, it is the ability to imagine alternatives, because if you have options, your mind feels wider, and if you do not have options, your mind becomes very skilled at focusing on immediate problems. Because imagining alternatives can become painful if you cannot reach them. And yet, as sharp as these boundaries can be, daily life also contains a strange equalizer that no one can escape, the environment itself, the sun that does not care about rank, the heat that dries everyone's mouth, the dust that settles on every surface, the insects that do not ask whether you are rich before they bite, and this shared environment creates moments of shared experience. A moment where a wealthy person also swats at flies, where an official also wipes sweat, where a priest also feels tired, and these small moments are not revolutions, they do not erase hierarchy, but they remind you that the hierarchy is built on humans, and humans remain vulnerable in the same physical world. On the street, you can sometimes see these shared moments during unexpected events, a sudden gust of wind that blows dust into everyone's eyes, a jar that slips and breaks and makes everyone nearby jump, a donkey that refuses to move and forces a crowd to wait, and in those moments, for a few seconds, everyone becomes simply a person reacting, not a rank, not a role, just a body in a moment, and then the system returns. But the glimpse is there. The city itself is a map of class, not with lines drawn, but with clusters and zones, areas where houses are packed tight, where workshops spill into the street, where the noise is constant, where privacy is rare, and other areas where walls are higher, where courtyards exist, where movement is slower, and these differences affect daily life like weather. They change how you sleep, how you socialize, how you argue, how you raise children. Because a crowded neighborhood forces you into community. Whether you like it or not, while a secluded compound allows you to choose community, and choice is always a luxury. For the poor, community can be both lifeline and pressure. Everyone knows everyone, help can arrive quickly, but so can judgment, so can gossip, so can social control, and daily life includes managing reputation carefully, not only for pride but for survival, because a good reputation can bring help when you need it, and a damaged reputation can isolate you at the worst time. And isolation is one of the most dangerous states in a resource-limited world. For the wealthy, reputation is managed differently, often through display, through donations, through formal connections, through participation in festivals and offerings, through maintaining relationships with officials, because power protects power, and daily life becomes partly about maintaining networks, sending gifts, showing loyalty, appearing generous, and these networks are not always cynical. Sometimes they are genuine relationships, but even genuine relationships become tools when the stakes are high. Work itself divides people into worlds, and one of the biggest divides is between those whose labor produces visible objects and those whose labor produces decisions. A craftsman can point to a pot or a linen cloth and say, "I made that," while an administrator points to a stable delivery and says, "I made that happen," and the difference shapes pride, because pride needs something to hold on to, and in daily life, pride is one of the few inner resources that can't be taxed away. Craft pride can be deep and quiet, the satisfaction of a straight cut, a smooth surface, a pattern that aligns, a color that holds, and you can imagine craftsmen teaching apprentices not only skills but attitudes, patience, attention, respect for materials, because materials fight back, wood splits, clay cracks, thread tangles, and daily life becomes an ongoing conversation between human intention and material reality. And then there are those who live closer to sacred service, not only priests, but cleaners, bakers, carriers, guards, people whose daily labor keeps religious life functioning without ever being named in grand inscriptions, and their daily life contains a double consciousness. They are near holiness but they still have to worry about bread, they sweep sacred floors but still have to bargain in the market. They handle offerings but still return to a modest house, and that proximity can create pride, but it can also create frustration, because being close to power does not mean having power. The more you watch, the more you realize that hierarchy is not one ladder, it is many ladders crossing. A person can be low in one context and high in another. A craftsman may be respected for skill even if he is not wealthy. A village elder may have authority locally even if he cannot read. A scribe may be socially powerful even if his body is physically weaker than a laborer's. And daily life is the constant navigation of these overlapping maps, knowing when you can speak, when you must stay quiet, when you can bargain, when you must accept. And despite all these differences, everyone shares certain daily anchors: the need for food, the need for water, the need for shade, the need for sleep, and these anchors create a shared human rhythm: morning preparation, midday adjustment, evening return, and in that shared rhythm you can feel why society can hold together even with inequality, because daily life offers constant moments where people's paths cross, in streets, In markets, in festivals, in work crews, and those crossings keep the society from becoming completely fragmented. Sometimes, in the evening, when the heat loosens, you can imagine a street where different classes pass each other without speaking, a household bringing water, a laborer returning with dust on his legs, an official walking with a calmer pace, a priest's attendant carrying something wrapped, and for a moment they are all silhouettes under the same sky, and you can feel how the civilization is not one story but many stories moving side by side, rarely merging, sometimes colliding, often simply coexisting.